Well, President Trump may be thinking about pardoning his former national security advisor, General Michael Flynn. This according to sources with direct knowledge of the president's thinking. Now, Flynn pled guilty in 2017 to lying to the FBI. Supporters of President Trump, though, have accused investigators of trying to coerce Flynn into those lies. They point to this handwritten note from an FBI counterintelligence official that reads, quote, "What is our goal? Truth/admission, or to get him to lie so we can prosecute him or get him fired?" Shortly after this note, the Department of Justice moved to drop the Flynn case, but the judge has delayed dismissal and ordered prosecutors to explain their decision. Now, President Trump and his allies have long criticized that initial investigation into Flynn's possible contacts with Russia, and they have accused the Obama administration of political retaliation. Flynn's one of several former Trump allies and campaign officials who were prosecuted in connection with the Russia probe. The list also includes Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, George Papadopoulos, Rick Gates, and Michael Cohen. So, Lisa, I'm going to come to you first. What I sometimes still question, and a lot of journalists, is why President Trump's supporters remain, and President Trump himself, remain so firmly behind General Flynn when we now know that Flynn lied to Vice President Pence and lied to the president himself about his contacts with the Russian ambassador during the transition, a very sensitive point in time for any incoming presidential administration. You know, Democrats say this man jeopardized national security. Why isn't the president and his supporters more upset about that?
Well, I think most of his supporters don't care about those accusations and don't care about a lot of the people, or at least, you know, don't really look too highly on many people in the media as well. But I would say this. Look, Michael Flynn, the FBI should have never talked to Michael Flynn in the first place. His calls with the former ambassador Kislyak were fine. They're doing this. He did the same thing that Ben Rhodes said that the Biden transition team is doing right now, having calls with foreign leaders. Further, someone in the Obama-Biden administration committed a felony by leaking classified information about those calls with the former ambassador Kislyak. And according to Peter Strzok's own notes, it was Joe Biden who raised the Logan Act, which we know is completely politically motivated because no one has ever been convicted under the Logan Act. So I think collectively, all of that, most people would sit back, or at least people that support this president, or I think even looking at it objectively, would say, yeah, Michael Flynn should be pardoned.
So, Sean, does that sound right to you? Should Michael Flynn be let off the hook for lying to the president and the vice president because a lot of people believe that the initial investigation was politically motivated? Should that be enough in a court of law to get him off?
Well, first off, I look at your original question, which was the conversation or the lie between General Flynn and Pence and with Trump. And that's between Flynn and Trump and Flynn and Pence and decisions whether he should stay in the administration and his truthfulness and veracity. But this has gone to a whole other level where the FBI has investigated him. And I would tell you that I think what they were doing was a setup to start this whole Russia collusion story. It was part of the war on President Trump, the effort to undermine his presidency and his election, to say Donald Trump could only win if he colluded with Russia. And a key piece to that puzzle was a prosecution of General Flynn. When we talk about what the main concern Democrats had or the FBI had was that General Flynn could be compromised and blackmailed by the Russians because he lied to Pence. Well, if that's the case, why isn't the media then interested in the money that potentially Hunter Biden got from China that was funneled to the big guy, which was Joe Biden, and the fact that President-elect potentially Biden could be blackmailed by the Chinese? That's a way bigger story than General Flynn, but nobody seems to care about that story, which concerns Americans about the fairness in reporting and the fairness of the FBI.
Jessica, what's your response to that?
A few things. On the Hunter Biden front, the story actually was out there in front of Americans. We know the New York Post ran a story, and then there were actually a series of incredibly embarrassing stories published after that about how people didn't even want their bylines on it. Joe Biden's son first of all, had that meeting in May of 2017. Joe Biden was not in office anymore when that happened, and the American people have spoken, and they have decided that Joe Biden should lead this country and not President Trump. To Lisa's point about the Logan Act, the DOJ has actually had to issue a statement saying that it's not true that Joe Biden brought up the Logan Act. It was an issue with a sticky, a Post-it note that they had put on these files that moved that around. Joe Biden had nothing to do with the prosecution or the setup of Michael Flynn, and frankly, that's not what happened here at all. If you look at the Mueller report, we know that there were contacts between people in Trump orbit, many of them now in jail, and the Russians, and they were trying to interfere in our election to the benefit of President Trump, not to Hillary Clinton. Michael Flynn has become this hero of the right. I don't really understand why, since, as you rightly point out, Jillian, he lied to the president and he lied to the vice president, though I fully expect him to go ahead and pardon him.
Carly,
there was no collusion, Jessica.
Carly, I want to get Carly in. Reasonable people.
We can talk about
I'll get back to you guys in a second. Reasonable people can kind of agree that he lied to, the president has said he lied to me, which is why he got fired, because he was no longer trustworthy to be his point man on national security in the West Wing. But Sean was making the point a moment ago that that doesn't mean a crime was committed. Flynn lied. He had paid a heavy price with his reputation, with his job. Should that be enough? Or is a pardon now going a step too far, Carly?
Right. Well, I think that President Trump sees Michael Flynn as a victim of an anti-Trump FBI. So this is very personal for him. Also, yes, Michael Flynn did admit to lying to the FBI. But then after that, a whole flood of information came out. We showed the image of the note that FBI agents wrote that said, should we get Michael Flynn to lie to get him fired? We also found out that they were originally going to clear Flynn, and then all of a sudden things changed, and they went after him. So the DOJ dropped the case, and then this is all being held up by a judge. So I think that a lot of folks would like to see President Trump go over this judge's head and issue him a pardon. And to the reason why Republicans find Michael Flynn such a sympathetic figure is because of the anti-Trump FBI thing, and also because he is a three-star general.
Lisa, let me get you back in here. What were you saying a moment ago?
No, I was just going to say we spent tens of millions of dollars and wasted years of our lives and attention to an issue that never happened, and there was no collusion. And that's what the Mueller investigation ultimately found. And we should have known that from the beginning, because it was entirely predicated on a false premise and falsely predicated on opposition research from Hillary Clinton, which actually gathered that information from Russian sources and people connected to the Kremlin. That's correct.
The Steele dossier. Jess, what's your response?
My response is that the Mueller report is very clear that they would have said explicitly that there was no collusion. If they could say that, they actually left it open-ended, which was a major criticism of the Mueller team and something that Democrats were very frustrated by, that they didn't come to a conclusion. Bob Mueller didn't feel like that was what he was there to charged to do. He was supposed to lay out everything there. And we also should take into account that there are a number of people in Trump orbit that are in prison for doing things related to working with foreign powers. Everyone glosses over this. And frankly, if you want to get a victim, someone to hold up about, deserving of a pardon, though it hasn't got to that point, we could talk about Carter Page and abuse of the FISA process. But Michael Flynn is not the guy for this.